Hi, I'm Jake Bicknell, and this is my DICE talk. Yes, thank you everybody for being here this evening. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jake Bicknell, one of the lecturers here. I've been here over 10 years, and I kind of wanted to use today as an opportunity to talk about a very, I think, important piece of research that I was very involved in. Sort of whilst writing the talk, I realized it was probably only about 25 minutes long, so I decided to add my Christmas special on the end. So look out for that, you won't be able to miss it. So I'm going to start with this idea that, in answering this question, does conservation action work? I'm going to sort of pick up where Neville left off a couple of weeks ago in the last DICE talk. And I want to sort of start our journey with considering this idea of the human niche. So niche being sort of the optimal conditions for a species. And, like any other species, we have that as well. And this research paper looked at basically what's going to happen as our planet continues to warm, and found that, the human niche exists quite well in parts of the world which are sort of between 11 and 15 degrees centigrade average temperature, mean average temperature. And the places that are sort of above about 29 degrees centigrade, we don't really thrive in. In fact, we do very badly in. And the bad news is that about 30% of the population are going to be subject to those sorts of temperatures by 2070, or at least that's what the global projections say, based on our business as usual scenario. So us doing, nothing new that's better for the planet than we are at the moment. And as a result of this at the moment, each year there are more displacements from climate impacts than there are actually from conflict. So that tells you the scale of what we're dealing with here. So we also need to really acknowledge that services provided by nature are pretty much the only reason that we exist on this planet. Okay? Nature is the reason for our survival, but we can value that at about half of the global GDP. So that's all the money in the world that goes around. The equivalent of half of that, or 46 trillion each year, is services provided by nature, and that's done for free. But of course, you probably all know, and I'm not going to labor this point too much, we are driving nature into places that we don't want it to go, and it doesn't want to go. And the main drivers of biodiversity loss and nature's decline include land use change, pollution, invasive species, unsustainable use, and climate change. And this is sort of resulting in overall a changing planet that is rapidly changing at a rate that we can't adapt, and most species can't adapt either. So we can sort of put some numbers on that. Well, biodiversity is declining faster than at any point in human history. The rate of species extinction is getting worse, it's accelerating, and there are now warnings of grave impacts for human society at the highest levels of political expertise. In terms of populations of wildlife, we've seen a 73% decline since records began, and we're losing species pretty much every day. So people like my daughter here love to interact with wildlife, but that's changing. And the most recent extinction, just last month, the slender-billed curlew, which hasn't been seen in North Africa, where it belongs, for about 30 years now. So this is the last declared extinction just a few weeks ago. So you could say we kind of have two paths. One where we kind of carry on doing what we're doing, and one possibly a better path. And in that path, you might imagine that there is plenty of conservation action. And conservation action is what I came to talk to you about this evening. So we need to ask first, what is conservation action? Or at least what did we consider it to be for the research that I want to focus on this evening? Yes, it is planting trees, habitat restoration. Yes, it is protecting rhinos. It's working with landowners and farming systems. It's working with local people and indigenous lands. It's all of those things. But it's also working with policymakers. And policymakers probably drive some of those things that I talked about just now as well. So let's again talk, just briefly summarize what Neville told us about those important policies last month. We've got the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was signed in 1992, and most countries signed up to it, apart from a few key ones. But generally, this is the accepted framework under which a lot of conservation action is kind of programmed, if you like. And in 2020, governments adopted the Aichi targets, and that was the first time we really talked about tackling the biodiversity loss and its drivers. And most recently, governments have adopted the new global targets to halt and reverse. So this is the first time we've got sort of seeing those kinds of terminology, to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. And this is what we call the Global Biodiversity Framework. And these all fit under that Convention on Biological Diversity banner. And so today, we actually spend about $121 billion a year on conservation actions and conservation-related activities. But unfortunately, 0 of the Aichi targets were fully met by their 2020 deadline. So we might conclude that conservation actions are ineffective or insufficient, there's not enough of them, and we might also predict that the Global Biodiversity Framework, that latest framework, will also be not achieved at all. So we need to know, does conservation action work? And that's exactly what we set out to do in this large research program that took over 10 years to do. And it's a big collaboration between multiple organizations, but the core team were represented by Rewald, being Penny Langhammer being the lead author from Rewald, me at DICE, and Joe Ball at Oxford, who was previously at DICE as well when he came on board with this study, and Tom Brooks at the IUCN, who's a very well-known conservationist. Plus multiple collaborators from all over the world. And we published this paper in Science. And I want to tell you, so Science being one of the kind of key journals for sort of high-impact work. I want to tell you more about what we did and what it showed, and kind of what it means as well. So bear with me, some of the technicalities. We did a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis means that you bring together lots of published research and you kind of analyze it together to see what those general trends are. A meta-analysis came out of this idea in medicine that there'll be many studies that are testing the effectiveness of, say, a drug. And many studies might have come to different conclusions or subtly different conclusions. And so under a meta-analysis, it's sort of putting all those data sets together and seeing what those overall trends are to sort of ask that bigger question. So in a meta-analysis, you basically search for all the published studies on a subject, in this case conservation action or its effectiveness, extract the data and analyze it as one, whilst meeting some important statistical assumptions. And what you do is you generate something called an effect size. So an effect size is basically shown by this thing called a forest plot here, and the further away you are from this line, the greater the effect there is. So I'm going to ask the question, what's the sort of impact of a conservation action? And we can sort of think of that as the more impact is the bigger the effect size, or the bigger the effect size, the greater the impact. And another key sort of slightly technical part of a meta-analysis is that the studies that have the largest sample size or did things in the most robust way kind of get a little bit more weight when you're calculating these averages. So this is like an average of many studies shown in this plot here. And the best studies contribute a little bit more to that because they sampled more people or did it over a longer time frame or something like that. And so in this study about conservation actions, we only considered conservation outcomes that were measured over time. So rather than assessments or studies that just looked at a single time point to see whether something worked, we only considered studies that went back and remeasured things over and over again. And we only considered studies that had a realistic counterfactual. So a counterfactual means somewhere with no conservation action compared to somewhere with conservation action, and are otherwise trying to be pretty much the same. So here's our sort of example here. We've got that side of the river, protect that mountain. Everything else is broadly speaking the same. They're not too far away from each other. The habitat types are the same, but one of them gets a conservation intervention or conservation action, and one of them doesn't. You measure both of them multiple times to see, what the outcome of that intervention was. And so in short, in this paper, we only used in the meta-analysis the most comprehensive and robust studies that ask this question about conservation actions. And all of those come together to make this one big analysis. And the data set in this figure shows time. So this is time since the conservation actions begun and when they ended. Each line represents a different study. The point represents when the paper was published. Not hugely important for this bit, but the map also shows you where those conservation actions happened. And so we had about 186 studies, and some of those studies measured multiple things, so they end up contributing more than just one data point to the analysis. So we've got 186 studies, but 665 trials or data points, however you want to think about it. They represent over 100 years of conservation action, but most were kind of in the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years. They do look at across the globe, but there's certainly a spatial bias in where those conservation actions happened, in that it's covering more of the developed world and not that much in Africa. Of course, this is something that we would like to update in the future and bring in more data sets as possible. So it's a global study, but it's not as representative as maybe we would like it to be. And the intervention types that were considered in this study map directly onto those sort of government frameworks that I mentioned before, the CBD, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the HE targets. And we considered protected areas, habitat loss reduction and restoration, which might seem like a funny grouping, but again, this is how it was done in those global targets. Sustainable management of ecosystems, which shows you things like farming practice being distributed across a whole county or a whole region, or forestry practice used across a whole country or something like that, looking at the impact of that. Invasive and problematic species and control of those. Sustainable use of species, and then we had this other category, which I won't go into now, but it has a few things like climate change adaptation, pollution control, and things like that. And this other category was simply because we didn't have enough of each of those things to give them their own category. And so you can see that we've got 71 of those 186 studies come from protected areas, 23 come from that category, and so on. So you can see where the distribution of the data across those different interventions. So, some results. Firstly, we're going to ask a very simple question. What proportion of the studies showed successful conservation actions? And so what we find is that these top two categories, 66% fall into those top two categories. This is where conservation has a positive impact. So those top two categories, conservation works. Now in the top left category, what we see is that the intervention, this is where our conservation action is happening, biodiversity is increasing, and where conservation isn't happening, it's either increasing a bit less, or it's going down, or it's staying the same. So that kind of red bar shows you, the potential options that are happening in the absence of conservation versus the conservation. Then we come over here, we have examples where biodiversity still declined, but it declined at a lesser rate than under the counterfactual, so where no conservation happened, things were even worse than where that conservation action happened. And so we can sort of say that, okay, in those cases, 2/3 of studies in this data set showed successful conservation actions. But then when we come down here, we can see that there are examples where conservation didn't work, or at least somewhat didn't work. So we might see the example on the bottom left where actually where there was no conservation action, biodiversity increased even more than it did where there was conservation action, or in this bottom right one where we have biodiversity increased or stayed the same, but actually under no conservation action, but where there was conservation action, it went down. So that sort of suggests something went really wrong. So I'll delve into some of the examples of why this might happen in a minute. And then moving on to looking at the overall impact of conservation, and I want you just to look at this top bar for now. This is the overall impact of conservation. If you remember earlier I showed you a forest plot, and basically the further we are from this zero line, the greater the impact of conservation. So sorry, this is a bit technical, but I'm going to break it down in a slightly different way after I've got through this bit. What we can see is that this is the sort of mean and the confidence intervals of all the studies that are used in that meta-analysis. And what we see is that basically this is far away from the zero line. Conservation action is working. Good news. We could break it down by these different intervention types: protected areas, working, sustainable use of species, overlaps that zero line. Not a huge amount of data, not that many studies going into that part of this figure. And so we could say maybe that's inconclusive. Sustainable management of ecosystems, clearly a positive impact, a good conservation outcome. Habitat loss reduction and restoration, again, a good conservation outcome. And invasive and problematic species control, a good conservation outcome. And you might remember that I also mentioned we have this other category, which is not shown here, but it does contribute to that overall outcome that we see at the top there. We also measured, we broke down the studies in a different way to look at what's the conservation action actually targeting. Is it targeting the ecosystem, sort of large landscape scale conservation actions? Or is it targeting the species level, or is it targeting the genetic level? And you can see the sort of relative differences of each of those. They're all kind of working. So I didn't show anything particularly novel, but we can see that whatever level you target, it might work, or it has the opportunity to work. But as you'll see in a minute, it kind of comes down to the context and what's really happening on the ground. And in this study, we also showed that we might be getting better at conservation. So this is all of our effect size of each of those studies, and this is the publication year of each of those studies. And because that line is going up, but only a little bit, it suggests that we might be actually honing our skills as conservationists, which again is really good news. Probably means we're learning from what we've got wrong in the past, and we're learning from what didn't work. So there's this indication that the impact of conservation is improving over time. So let's go back and consider what happens when conservation action doesn't work. So I wanted to just give you a couple of examples. So when conservation action doesn't work, in this example we've got under the counterfactual, where there's no action, biodiversity went up more than it did where there was conservation action. And in this example we have we have a marine protected area and an unprotected part of that same system. And the idea for that protected area was to focus on seahorses to boost their populations. But unfortunately, that intervention also helped the octopuses and some large fish, which prey on our seahorses. And so ultimately, for seahorses, this was one of those studies that didn't work. Although you could argue that it did actually work for the octopuses and it did work for other things, but not the thing that was being targeted by that action. Nonetheless, this would have been considered one of those 33% where conservation actions didn't work. And we can look at another example, sort of our worst category of conservation action, where the intervention goes down. So under conservation action, biodiversity goes down when it might have actually gone up or stayed the same in the absence of that intervention. And we have an example here where in the Indian Ocean, they had to remove a lot of invasive algae that had got released from algae farms nearby. And they had taken over these reefs. And so the idea was to remove the algae by picking it off by hand. And And that made it break into smaller pieces, made it disperse further and actually take over more of the reef, and ultimately lead to further declines in coral cover and native algal cover. So this is one of those examples that I think conservationists would learn from. It's been published, and maybe that approach won't be used for those sorts of things again. So this is where we might be, improving and honing our skills over time. So what about some examples of conservation action where it works? So again, those last two studies were in the meta-analysis, and the next couple are as well. In this example, those conservation practitioners wanted to help two species that were breeding on these barrier islands in Florida, loggerhead turtles and least terns, a small bird. And they were suffering from predation from invasive predators, namely raccoons and pigs. And that removal of that predator resulted in up to 100% improvement in success rates of that nesting compared to islands where they hadn't done that conservation intervention. And of course, it makes sense. Take away the problem, you might result in something positive. A lot of these things are intuitive, of course. Then we might get into some more nuanced examples, like this study, more at the landscape scale, which explored whether protected areas and indigenous-owned lands in the Brazilian Amazon resulted in improvements in the amount of fires and the amount of forest loss. And indeed, they showed that deforestation was between 1.7 and 20 times higher, and human-caused fires occurred 4 to 9 times more frequently outside the perimeters of those protected areas and those indigenous lands. So again, sustainable management of ecosystems category where things are sort of working. And this is the more nuanced examples where you can't really be sure whether those things are going to work. And so a different example again for a salmon population which is going through a large decline. They started to bring the wild salmon into captivity to help boost their breeding success. And they showed that basically the fish that had come into captivity to kickstart and protect them from predators and pollution and other problems that were happening in the river resulted in up to 4.7 times more offspring than the naturally reproducing fish that hadn't undergone this conservation intervention. Again, kind of makes sense, but once you release something like this back into the river, you don't know if it's going to survive. But in this case, it did quite well. And not in the meta-analysis, I just want to sort of shout out about things that we've been doing here on the University of Kent campus, where we have one of the largest and best studied populations of great crested newts in the world, thanks to the actions of hundreds of Kent staff and students over the last 20 years. And a big shout out to Richard, who's there for setting up this thing in the first place. It's the only reason it exists. And this is something that I'd like to see here at the university, something that we can carry on doing. These are our sort of grassroots approaches to conservation that we can all get involved in. But sort of like that example, which is published, conservation action is often unmeasured and unpublished. And I wanted to sort of consider those things because there's a science paper with 186 studies captured, but that's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to actually what's being done on the ground. So I'm going to start with, consider this with a little video of an indigenous community helping out their local population of large fish. And it's from the country of Guyana, which is where I've been working for about 20 years. And so I use this as an example because it's close to my own heart. But this is an example of a local community they've got a long history of consuming that fish, one of the largest freshwater fish in the world, the arapaima. But they also have a local sport fishing business where people come from all over the world to come and fish the arapaima and to catch them and release them. But increasingly, with the changing climate and the very unpredictable dry and wet seasons, we're getting these extreme dry seasons and then nothing for a few years, and then an extreme wet season and then nothing for a few years. It's like their dry season and wet seasons are now kind of going through 3 or 4 year cycle when they used to go through a 6-month cycle. But as a result of that, these Arapaima get stuck in these tiny ponds and it dries out. And of course, it makes perfect sense that these local communities, if they release them, if they drag them into the river, as you saw in the video, it probably helps their population. Not been checked, not been assessed, but they also breathe air, so they can take them over land for about 5 to 10 minutes without them dying, essentially. Ooh, did I miss one? So, some conclusions from the study. Overall conservation actions have helped to slow the decline in biodiversity. Some intervention types, so some of those conservation actions we talked about, and context that I want to throw in there as well, probably result in better conservation outcomes than others. And I mean, I always say that conservation is exceptionally complex and every situation is very different. And of course, we need to work with people in every case as well. While the state of biodiversity is still declining in absolute terms, conservation action is much better than doing nothing, and that's kind of what this study shows. And just throw out there that conservation actions are investments rather than payments because of our intrinsic need to conserve biodiversity for ourselves as a human society. And it turns out that people did enjoy this good news when it was published in April, because I often get told by people in the media, oh, the public only like drama and bad stories and bad news. And so we were a little bit unsure how to tackle spreading the word of this paper. But we did our best, and it got picked up in media, including the BBC. It was on national TV in the UK, the US, and France, and radio, and picked up some numbers of potential reach of 950 people apparently through the social media and the press releases that were done, and included posts by Leonardo DiCaprio's team. And this thing called an altmetric looks at how much action a scientific paper is getting. And the key thing here is in the top 5% of all research ever published. So very good news. And yeah, it means that people were interested in this story. So people do like good news, it turns out. So let's think about what's next. How do we bend the curve of biodiversity loss? How do we sort of avoid this business as usual scenario and go towards something that might bring back nature's recovery? Well, the challenge is obviously to reduce our impacts on biodiversity and our impacts in nature in general, reduce our overconsumption, certainly in some parts of the world, and of course to scale up conservation actions, because we've now shown that they work. Of course, this is going to require political will, scaled up funding, and ongoing assessment. So more scientists doing more of that stuff that we need. So I'm just going to pick up on two of those points. Scaled up funding. A comprehensive conservation program has been shown that it will cost between 178 and 524 billion each year to achieve the CBD targets. And we said at the moment we're spending 121 billion. Okay, so we're not quite there. But if you put this in context, fossil fuel subsidies get 7 trillion a year. So we could just tap into some of that and we can achieve some of that. But we need more conservationists and more of us, and that's kind of one of the places in this storyline that DICE fits in. DICE has now got over 1,700 alumni, and we know that many of them are out in the world doing these conservation actions or conservation assessments, doing conservation science as well. So big up to my employer there. So please use hashtag #conservationworks, and sing and dance about conservation's working, because ultimately that will keep us employed as well. Then there's more of it to be done. And now there's something completely different, which is the other part of my talk. You're not allowed to leave now, Maddie. This is Rudolph. Thank you, Jake. The next segment of this talk is called Things That Jake Found Mostly on the Internet That Made Him Love Nature Even More Than He Already Does. And then he decided it should represent the 12 days of Christmas. And this is, of course, the working title. But the point is, I wanted to celebrate that conservation works. I wanted to celebrate Christmas too. Celebrate wildlife. So I'm going to start with the courtesy of the comedywildlifephoto.com. And this is our partridge in a pear tree. The rest of them don't really fit with the actual 12 Days Christmas, just like this one doesn't. But for those of you that know about my obsession with squirrels, it turns out the Comedy Wildlife Awards are also obsessed with squirrels. This is just a few of the squirrels. It's so many squirrels. Anyway, I'm going to move on from squirrels. So things I found on the internet. This is number 2. And this is actually the inspiration for this part of the talk, because I saw that photo and I absolutely loved it. And I was like, I love frogs even more than I already did now. And human hands and stuff. This is Centurio senex, also known as the wrinkle-faced bat. And I came across this guy in Honduras. I was working with Operation Wallacea. And the reason I bring this one up is that it's just so ugly. It's really a face that only a mother could love. But what's cool about it is that that face is that way for a reason. So they sort of dive into overripe and rotten fruit, and it helps all the juices filter into their mouth. So, yeah, Centurio senex, don't forget. Some of you might know I'm a surfer. It's just so intentional as well. Love that one. You can watch it again later. Some of you might know about Robert Fuller's trampolining stoats. I still can't work out if that's 2 stoats or 1, but it's just amazing. I mean, this one went viral, so you might have seen it before. I mean, who wants a flying squirrel as a pet? I do. Dwarf mongoose. You've got to listen to the lady. I love the attack at the end. That's why I went all the way to the end. I love the attack at the end because it's like, oh, you didn't notice me, I'm dead. Adventures of our undergrads in Costa Rica. No students were harmed or butterflies in the making of this video, and I did get permission from Abby before showing this. Abby wasn't sure about handling butterflies. You can just watch that bit on repeat. And before I finish off, I wanted to talk about the adventures of Jake's bird feeders, because, again, the squirrels and the pigeons and everything, I mean, it's a wonder I get any work done, but the squirrels have been a bit of a theme, and this guy visited daily and couldn't work out how to get to the feeder for a very long time, but eventually solved the problem and often falls 2 stories and winds itself and then stays there for a few minutes and then walks off into the tree a bit gingerly. But anyway, so eventually I just let it come and it's all fine. One day, hot day, windows open. This was not part of his plan. All fine. Came back the next day, probably the same afternoon, when I closed the door to let it through. But my cat also is notoriously dumb. Don't get a window feeder, you won't get any work done. If I was to narrate this, I'd just say, I'll give up. Who cares? There's a window in the way. But if you enjoyed that, I don't have time today because it's 20 minutes long, but please Google backyard squirrel maze. This guy goes to lengths to stop the squirrels, and it is hilarious. Please have a look. And my last video, Houdini Fox from right here on campus. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions?
I was going to say something. It was something I wanted to say to Neville, and I forgot about. But do you think it's important to kind of set ambitious targets, even if we know that we can't reach them? Because he was saying about kind of the new targets that are set, and everybody's going, well, we can't reach it. Why would we set them? That's pointless. But is there an element to be made for like optimism and just saying, well, we should try?
Yeah, that could hardly be a more important question, could it? God, I think you could probably get 20 different answers from 20 different conservation scientists. But yeah, I'd rather we shoot the moon. I would rather we go for what needs to be done, and ask funders, ask for political will, ask for all of us to get involved and do our bit. I can see the argument for trying to be more realistic, but ultimately what needs to be done to stop, for us all to have the lifestyles that we live at the moment and enjoy the benefits that we get from nature, I think that those targets are what needs to be done.
Thanks.
Yep, Sam?
Thank you for talking. I was just wondering if in any part of the work you looked at the sort of value for conservation, how show certain actions, averaged across the study kind of have a greater impact, but did you sort of do any sort of value for money sort of?
No, we didn't. I think that's a really good point. I don't know whether, getting rid of an invasive rat is cheaper than establishing a massive protected area. I don't know, but I think there's been work that might have been done on that. But yeah, that's a really important point. And I think, as I said, this is kind of the idea of this paper is to start a conversation. And we're hoping that it builds into many more ideas, and maybe that's some work that you can do in the future, Sam. Ash, you had your hand up.
Just two examples you gave of conservation not working were in marine ecosystems. Was that reflecting the whole study that conservation tends to work less in marine ecosystems?
No, I don't think so. I mean, out of those, so we said we got 186 studies and 33% were, conservation not working. From what I remember, the minority of studies across the whole data set were actually marine. So I would say that there's plenty of terrestrial examples as well. It's just those two are sort of quite easy to sort of pick up on the mechanism and watch it occurred. And I chose the seahorse one because also I want to illustrate that sometimes when we conclude it's not working, it might be benefiting something else. So, yeah.
Just wondering, so in obviously the areas where there's been conservation action, if there'd been maybe knock-on effects of that on the surrounding areas, what don't have actions, whether it be for the better or worse, you potentially, I don't know, for example, if you had a protected area, maybe the rate of decline in the area next to it becoming more because there's less space, and if there's resource extraction going on, it concentrates, for example, or alternatively, maybe biodiversity's actually increased, or
Yeah.
any examples of that?
Good point. I think there's a term for that, isn't there, Bob?
It's leakage.
Leakage.
Horrible term. But in the literature, it's called leakage.
Yeah, so it's a known phenomenon, essentially. Yeah. So I guess some of the studies that we included in the meta-analysis might have picked up on that, might have even accounted for it. But yeah, invariably it's quite difficult to design a study that achieves all of those things and also considers leakage.
Yeah, just to ask, from your studies, is there a silver bullet of what you can say there are a set of conservation intervention that works in a particular context and that probably can focus on going forward if we want to see more conservation work being taken into action?
Yeah, I'd say no. I don't think there's one size fits all. If a rat is eating all of the eggs of a ground nesting bird and you remove the rat, then yeah, that's the thing that works there. But removing rats from somewhere where rats are not the problem is not going to work. So I know that doesn't perfectly answer the question, but I think, yeah, conservation is so many juggling factors, and humans are at the heart of that. And so I think, yeah, there's signs that we might be learning as conservationists. But I think every situation is completely different and needs action, assessment, monitoring and evaluation to see if it's worked. There's also, I didn't mention tonight, there's a website called Conservation Evidence, which is a sort of large database that has way fewer criteria than what we used in the meta-analysis here. A large database of conservation interventions and whether they work or not. And you can access that online, and you can just type in, invasive algae or something like that, and you can find studies that have, tried out different things. So I think we're learning, but I really think that every situation is completely different because there's just so many factors. It's not like a Rubik's cube. It's like 10 million Rubik's cubes being juggled at the same time. Different levels of biodiversity, habitats, people, nature. I think, yeah, there's definitely no silver bullet, in my opinion. I think we had a question. Mohammed? Yep.
What was the last one?
No, I think mine's not.
Oh, okay. So after publishing a paper, what type of reactions did you receive online or from different groups of people? Because this is quite a paper which is understandable by the public. So what was the reaction from compassionate conservation people, normal conservationists, people, social media stuff?
Everything, including negative reactions. So on the positive reactions, it's, a lot of people saying this is a really nice storyline, we get on board with it, it makes sense. Conservation action is targeting something, it makes sense that it works most of the time. But then on the other side of things, they say the data set's not representative enough, and I covered that in tonight's talk, saying, well, this is a conversation starter. And people also saying it's a dangerous message to ask for more conservation action when we're not able to fund what we're doing at the moment. So, something, as you say, something this high profile in the sciences got every type of reaction that you can possibly imagine, and then hundreds of emails from hundreds of scientists all over the world saying, oh, how did you do this? How did you do this? And those are still things that we're dealing with now, to be honest. So yeah, every possible reaction, probably more positive than negative. come down here first and then Monty.
There's a statistic about, I think, the success rates of different targeted conservation towards like ecosystems or species, or I can't remember what the third category was. Could you think, how important is that statistic in maybe planning future conservation work, or where, maybe more valuable to focus conservation?
I think there's been there's been a lot of literature on, conservation should be focusing on areas with the highest biodiversity at the greatest threat. We heard from Bob a few months ago about hotspots. So in terms of intervention types, I don't think we should look at this study to say, oh, this intervention's the best one, because it depends on what's the problem and then what's the appropriate intervention. So I think, we can learn from that to say, okay, these types of interventions probably have a positive impact, and these ones we're not sure about. But I also go back to the question that my answer earlier is that, the right action is the right action for that situation, rather than we can learn from this to use that. But it does start the conversation, I think. Yeah. And Monty.
Yeah. Can I ask, do you think this kind of paper, the results of this kind of paper is, do you think it encourages funders and investors in the future to basically put more money into conservation, especially with the result of it specifically says how much money we need. I think it was how much money we need to reach that sort of level.
Yeah.
Because people they need often they want to be sure of what they're doing, and then they'll be more confident to invest. Do you think that these kind of papers actually end up in more investment, more money?
Yeah, I would like to think so, because you're telling the investor that you've proven that generally conservation works, so it's a good investment. It's not going to be down the pan. Have people come out of the woodwork and offered us loads of money? Hard to track it directly to a paper. Rewild are a very large organisation, sort of at the helm of the study, and they are very well funded already. And part of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, I think that restricts where they can get extra money from. But I would like to think so, I think is my gut feeling answer to your question. But yeah, it's only been 6 months or 7 months since the publication, so yeah.
Time for one more question.
Well, Ella's got her hand up.
If this was to translate into one ask for policymakers, what do you think it would be?
Very good question.
I'm looking at the aliens for help on that one.
4 or 5 questions.
You stumped me there. One ask for policymakers. You could go with the very generic, like conservation works. Let's fund it to this degree that I showed that paper that showed it's 178 billion to 500 billion is needed based on the estimates. I think on one hand we could say we need more conservation action. I actually think that step one is we need to reduce our impacts on nature and environment. So I'd say let's fund that more. And then pick up the pieces with conservation action. Just a general extra funding for conservation action. It works. I'd probably spend a lot of money on training new, young conservationists in every corner of the world. That's probably what I'd ask for.
Great. Well, the problem of being in a really good place is when you praise things, it sounds like platitudes. But first of all, fantastic questions. We've been saying it for weeks now, but they're really well done. Those are some fantastic in-depth questions. And finally, thank you, Jake, for a fantastic talk about some fantastic work and some fantastic squirrels. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.